Very big and deep.
You know what? There's no cushion. Let me just ask, you need a cushion?
I do.
Yes.
I mean, I'm mostly writing the sorts of things like I spoke. So I'm not going to write a book. I read the staff report.
When are you heading out of town?
Thursday. I'm going to Baltimore tomorrow. I don't know if you know Sharon Robinson.
Yes. She won't.
No, she teaches what thank you very much. She's on disability leave, and she was teaching at George Washington.
You don't have plans on putting it on here again, do you?
Only if I'm invited. I have no. What is your project? What are you doing?
Okay, good evening, everyone. Can people in the back hear me? Okay, good. Glad the microphone is working. Okay, thank you all for coming. It's a huge honor for me to be in conversation tonight with Joel Beinin, who I'll introduce in a moment. I want to first thank Busboys and Poets, especially Andy Shalal and his team for hosting us tonight. Those of us who've been involved in Israel-Palestine questions and activism know from painful experience that often when you try to organize an event at a bookstore on this topic at the last moment, the event tends to get canceled because of outside pressure. But one of the good things about Busboys and Poets is that Andy Shalal in particular has a very firm spine, which means that he's not doesn't allow himself to be intimidated. And this bookstore has really become a community space where we're able to gather during these very dark times to talk about the world that we live in, particularly the question of Palestine and the genocide in Gaza. So I want to begin by thanking Busboys and Poets. I want to also thank my colleague who's in the crowd tonight, Elliot Kola, for being the driving force behind having Joel in town for the last few days. And the other preliminary announcement I have to make is that this event is not officially co-sponsored with Georgetown University. It's co-sponsored with one of the centers at Georgetown University. We're running a Gaza lecture series, which brought Joel to town, and the center that I direct is one of the centers that's co-sponsoring the event tonight. If I don't make that announcement, I get a very immediate call from the powers that be at Georgetown University asking, why are you doing this, and how do you explain yourself? So this is not officially sponsored by Georgetown University, but it is sponsored by the academic center that I direct at Georgetown University. Joel Beinin is the Donald J. McLaughlin Professor of History and Professor of Middle East History Emeritus at Stanford University. His research and writing has focused on the social and cultural history and political economy of the modern Middle East, Egypt, Palestine, Israel, and on U.S. foreign policy. He's written and edited 12 books, authored numerous scholarly articles, and many public intellectual essays. For many of us growing up who are in the field of in academic work, he's been a role model, both in terms of his academic scholarship, his public intellectual work, and his activism. I first encountered Joel's name when I was an undergraduate student, which seems like a lifetime ago, during the first Palestinian Intifada in the late 1980s, when he co-edited an important book with Zachary Lockman on the Palestinian Intifada. And I've been reading his work ever since. It's deeply shaped my own understanding. I teach his work in my courses, and so it's wonderful to be in conversation with him. The topic tonight is the genocide in Gaza and international solidarity. And the format is that Joel and I are going to have a public conversation on that topic for maybe about half an hour, 40 minutes, and then we're going to turn it over to you for comments and questions. And I want to begin with a broad question. And I want to ask Joel, take as much time as you need to sort of answer it, because it's a question that sort of hit me in a very profound way in the last few weeks after I was looking very closely at the 20-point peace plan that Trump has dreamt up and now has proposed and now has been passed by the UN Security Council. So it has the force of international law. And, you know, the big broad question, and, you know, I hate to quote Bernard Lewis here, but, you know, what went wrong? And let me just say what I mean by that. So I'm looking at the 20-point peace plan, which is actually an annex to the UN Security Council resolution. And if you read it closely, if you know the background to it, this is a plan that was effectively written by and designed by Jared Kushner and Tony Blair. Close consultation with the Netanyahu government, no Palestinian input whatsoever. And if you look at the plan, one of the things that stands out and that's so shocking is effectively this plan, which has now been supported by and endorsed by the UN Security Council, effectively turns over the Gaza Strip to Donald Trump. In other words, the keys of Gaza have been handed over to Donald Trump, who heads this thing called the Board of Peace. There's language in there that there might be some sort of Palestinian self-determination or state down the road, but it's all subject to American and Israeli veto. And so when I was reading the plan for an essay that I just wrote on the topic, and I was thinking deeply about it, it suddenly hit me that, you know, 100 years roughly after the Balfour Declaration, or 100 years, a bit more, after the 1922 British Mandate, we're back to where we started. In other words, looking at the plan, it looks very much like the British Mandate. Now it's an American-British mandate. In this case, the United States is very much in control, so are the Israelis. The Palestinians are basically relegated to, you know, servants of the administrators. Gaza is effectively a trusteeship in ways that are eerily similar to, you know, the British Mandate. And so the big question for you, Joel, when we sort of look at this moment, you know, the genocide notwithstanding, how did we get here? It's like the Palestinians are back to where they started from. And in fact, I would say it's much worse now than it was back in 1922. But, you know, Donald Trump now is in full control of Gaza. There's no reason to think that his plan is going to stop. There's effectively very little government international support for the Palestinians. I mean, Malaysia, Colombia, Brazil, but, you know, all the powers that be, and critically the powers that be within the region, the Arab and Islamic world, are solidly behind this plan. So looking back over, you know, the last 100 years as a historian of the Middle East, how do we explain in broad terms how the question of Palestine has come full circle and the Palestinians are back to where they began? What went wrong?
Wow. So first of all, thank you, Nader, and let me add my thanks to Busboys and for all of you who have come, half of whom I actually know personally. So I could answer that question in the way that Rashid Khalidi did in his book, The 100 Years War on Palestine, in which he begins with the Balfour Declaration and argues that the...
Yeah.
Closer? Okay.
Yeah, hold it right up to your mouth,
All
thank
right.
you.
He argues that, and then I'm always afraid there's going to be too much feedback. He argues that the international community has always lined up against the Palestinian people and against Palestinian aspirations for self-determination and statehood, and that after the establishment of the State of Israel, international community was aligned with Israel against the Palestinian people. And one way that you could read the events since October 7th, 2023, is just as a continuation of that. So that would be a simple way to answer the question. But I think while it's a reasonable approach, it's not wholly adequate to explain what seems to me to be a kind of rupture with October 7th, 2023. And there are two ways, at least, to read that rupture. One way is the way that certain parts of the Palestine Solidarity Movement have read the rupture. The Netanyahu governments since 2009 all had this notion of managing the question of Palestine and believed that they were successfully managing it, and that included a certain relationship with Qatar and allowing Qatar to stream money into the Gaza Strip to effectively support Hamas governance and whatever else they did with the money, and periodically mowing the lawn, 2008-9, 2012, 2014, and Hamas's attack broke that paradigm, made it impossible, and put the question of Palestine on the international agenda in a way that opens a road towards the liberation of Palestine. I don't think that's right, but that's one way to understand it. A second way to understand it is to look at Israel's response to October 7th. We presumably don't have to debate in this crowd whether or not it has been a genocidal response, and to see that every so-called international norm has been broken. Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, explained to us in a speech at Davos few days back that President Trump and American foreign policy have broken what was called the international rules-based international order, which never really was as functional as anyone, as its proponents claimed it to be. But I would argue that Gaza broke the rules-based international order, which was always honored in the breach more than really upheld as an international standard. And we saw that every Western democracy, with the honorable exceptions of Ireland and Spain, either full-on supported or looked on passively while Israel committed a genocide. China and Russia didn't much care. Israel's Arab neighbors, both the signatories to the Abraham Accords and all the others, didn't intervene or exercise any pressures that might have caused Israel to act differently. And For those reasons, I would emphasize Gaza as a rupture. And what that means is that we don't know, we can't know yet what's coming next. It's absurd to imagine, as the best possible reading of the 20-point peace plan would, that somehow Humpty Dumpty is going to be put back together again, and in the process of rebuilding the Gaza Strip, the possibilities will be opened up for Palestinian self-determination and a Palestinian state and two-state solution and kumbaya. Nothing of that is likely to happen. In fact, we ought to be very clear that even the full terms of the first stage of the 20-point peace plan haven't yet been realized.
Can you remind us of that?
So we do not have, we do have an exchange of captives. All of Israel's captives, dead and alive, have been returned. They have been exchanged for a certain number of Palestinian captives. Israel still has another 6,000 Palestinian captives, many of them in administrative detention, meaning they have not been charged with any crime and have not been brought before any court. But okay, there was no promise that those 6,000 or so would be dealt with. So, okay, captives, check. Ceasefire? No. Israel has killed some 600 plus Palestinians, many of them children, since the peace plan was adopted. Withdrawal from the Gaza Strip? Well, Israel withdrew from 40-something% of the Gaza Strip, but then it has been actively expanding its own zone of control, literally moving the markers so that it has more and more of Gaza than what it was originally assigned to be, which was, I think, 52% of the Gaza Strip. So not even the full implementation of stage one. International Stabilization Force, stage two. All of the countries who have said that they might contribute troops to International Stabilization Force have said their troops will not be engaged in disarming Hamas. Their troops will not be engaged in fighting with Hamas, which is to say that we're still arguing about what the disarmament of Hamas actually means. Hamas argues that what it means is that they're ready to give up their offensive weapons and the tunnels, but they're keeping their AK-47s. Israel says, no, every last gun and rifle has to be taken away from them. That is never going to be happening. So, so we're not even going to be advancing to the second stage of anything. That's all gaslighting and shining people on that any of that is going to happen. I mean, let's be real. If you had a few $1 billion, do you think that the most productive place you could be investing it is in the Gaza Strip? No, that's absurd. That's not going to happen. No one is going to be investing big bucks to develop seaside resorts in Gaza Strip or high-rise apartments for whoever. That's simply not going to happen. So nothing of the substance of the more beyond the first 3 points of the 20-point peace plan is likely to happen. And we are still at the place where the whole Israeli assault on Gaza represents a shattering of the international order, which is consistent with different ways in which Trump's foreign policy has shattered international order, and which is also consistent with the global rise of neo-authoritarian ethno-national states like Hungary, like Modi's India, like Meloni's Italy, and the movements which aren't yet in power, but which are poised to come to power in Britain, in France, in Austria. The AfD likely won't come to power in Germany, but they are in a process of strengthening themselves. So what Israel has done in Gaza is consistent with this global upsurge of the authoritarian right, and that's why there's been no big international pushback against it, aside from the international human rights organizations and such like that.
I want to draw the historian out of you a bit more dramatically.
It doesn't hide.
Okay. So let me pose the same question that I posed to you, but from a different angle. In the last decade of his life, you will recall that Edward Said wrote extensively about the crisis of Palestinian national leadership. That, in the late 80s and in the 90s, particularly after the Oslo Accords, the leadership effectively, in the name of the PLO and Yasser Arafat, capitulated to sort of, the best deal that they can get. And there was no effective, organized, efficient, incorruptible leadership that could lead the Palestinians towards self-determination. That, when I was reading those essays as a young man, it deeply impacted me, and it sort of, the obvious sort of stared me in the face. How do you win a national liberation struggle if you don't have an effective, competent leadership? I don't know any case of a group of people fighting for national liberation where they didn't have somewhat of a competent leadership that could mobilize their supporters and the international community to win a struggle against their adversary. That strikes me as sort of one of the biggest sort of glaring obstacles that explains the plight of the Palestinians right now. That they once had a national leadership in the form of the PLO. That phase is gone. And what you see right now is you have this corrupt Palestinian so-called leadership in Ramallah that immediately jumped on board when Trump announced his 20-point peace plan. What a wonderful thing. And so unless that changes, I don't see how the Palestinians can begin to envision a better future unless there can be some sort of, for lack of a better term, some sort of new Palestinian leadership structured along the lines of the African National Congress that can mobilize the international community and shift the balance of power that exists right now that is heavily weighted on the side of Israel and its backers. I mean, that's, I think, one thing that you see right now that strikes me that's so vivid is that all of the political, economic, intellectual power is on one side of the Israel-Palestine divide, and the other side has very little power. It has a lot of moral support in the global community among activists and civil society sort of folks, but in terms of governments, in terms of military, in terms of economic power, it's a one-sided equation. So it would strike me as the gap here, the missing, missing ingredient here is you need an effective national liberation leadership, or else your movement isn't going to go anywhere. What do you think of that argument?
So the first thing I think of it is that I'm not going to say anything about what Palestinians need or don't need and what they do and don't need to do. That's not my place. I let the Palestinian, you want to invite a Palestinian up here and ask that question, that they can answer it. What I will say is this. There was a certain period between 1945 and, let's say, the end of apartheid in South Africa in 1991 that we might call the era of decolonization and national liberation. And broadly speaking, it shifted the global, I don't want to say balance of power, it severely diminished the global reach of Western imperial states, Britain, France, Indonesia, Netherlands and Indonesia, for example. That era is over. That process won't be repeated again. You don't get a second chance to do things like that. We might also note that in many cases, the results of that were quite disappointing. Let's look at Algeria, which was one of the global exemplars of decolonization. There aren't too many people who will be holding up Algeria today as a wonderful and glorious, liberated and free country. Even South Africa, which in many respects was the hardest struggle and managed to garner broad international support. Yes, it's a great victory that apartheid is defeated and many of the structures of oppression of the African majority remain in place. So that era was of great historic importance, and it did decolonize an important chunk of the world, but the broad democratic liberatory aspirations that decolonization was supposed to entail very often didn't happen. And in fact, the opposite happened. Many of those countries are brutal dictatorships that violate human rights and so on. So if we look at the question of Palestine in that historical context, the issue becomes, where are we now in world history? What possibilities are open to communities like the Palestinian people? And what are appropriate strategies? So I know how to ask those questions, and I don't know how to answer them.
Okay, well, let me pose another tough question for you here. Hopefully you can answer it. One of the issues that we find very difficult to talk about, both on campus and even in public settings, is the question of what legitimate and ethically grounded resistance to Israeli occupation can look like. In other words, what are the parameters of that type of conversation? International law allows for armed resistance against colonial and racist occupations. But when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict, having that type of conversation in terms of strategies of resistance, whether it's violent or nonviolent, generates a lot of heat in the room, and in the context of a university, often a phone call from my dean. You can't be hosting these conversations, you can't be legitimizing these groups that you're talking about. So as someone who's been studying this topic for most of your life, in the context of the question of Palestine, what would legitimate resistance, armed or not armed, look like in your view? And what would sort of a strategy of sort of national liberation look like for groups that are struggling for independence in the context of Israel-Palestine? Do you have any thoughts on that?
No. You're asking me questions that Palestinians have to answer and not a question that I'm going to answer. It's not my role to tell the Palestinians what they need to do or not do.
Okay, how about just then generally among any, if it would take it outside of the question of Palestine, you have a group of people who are facing a particular settler colonial occupation, and that inevitably produces resistance. And so what are the guidelines for sort of that particular theoretical sort of equation in terms of how one resists a settler colonial context?
So if I were a lawyer or teaching in a law school, I might draw out for you some kind of abstract argument about such things. I don't even know how to think like that, though. I can only do it concretely. So let's talk about the United States. We have here an example of settler colonial occupation of a good chunk of the continent of North America. History of expansion from sea to shining sea, kind of analog to from the river to the sea. It entailed genocide, multiple genocides, even if we count all of the various Native American communities that were annihilated or nearly annihilated. What should Native Americans do to regain their lands and their rights and their sovereignty? Well, just as I wouldn't be telling the Palestinians what to do, I'm not going to be telling Native Americans what to do. But do we imagine that it would be effective for, say, the Navajo people to organize on their reservation and burst out of their reservation and attack the people of Tucson, Arizona? How would that go down? Would that win any support anywhere? Would they be likely to win anything? No. As soon as we pose the question in those terms, it's obviously ridiculous. So mentioning that international law, which of course I just went through a whole argument about how it's essentially defunct as an operative thing in the world, but yeah, okay, international law allows for certain kinds of armed struggle, does not allow for random killing of civilians. So if you're relying on international law, you need to keep that in your background too. But it's an irrelevant category if we're thinking about this problem of how Native Americans could regain their lands and their rights and their sovereignty. We could we could conclude, okay, the United States government is a fact, and even though its power is radically waning over the last several decades and probably will continue to wane in the coming decades in the future, that scattered remnants of Native Americans aren't going to be able to resist them, and they should just take what they can get elected to public office, go do the civic things that American politics, at least for the next couple of years, allows. It may stop allowing them in 2026 or 2028. We don't know. I mean, I guess I want to insist that you're asking me to answer a question that I can't and won't answer.
Okay, let me come at it from a different way.
No, don't, because I won't answer it in any other way either. Go to a different question.
Okay, well, you mentioned in your talk today, he gave a great talk at Georgetown, that part of the narrative post-October the 7th was the Nazification of Hamas. I'm old enough to remember that very similar language was used against the PLO, almost identical back in the 70s and 80s, that these people are Nazis, they're terrorists. Back then they were allied with the Soviet Union. You can't agree with them. The PLO had a charter, Hamas had a charter. The framing and the depiction was very similar. And of course, my reading of that is the actual content of what these Palestinian groups stand for are really not the issue. The reason why they are depicted as Nazis is because they are resisting control and domination of Western interests in the region, and specifically Israeli interests. If you resist that type of domination and control, you're going to get depicted as a demon. That's fundamentally what's going on and why they're depicted in this way. If 10 years from now, another group emerges with some other political philosophy and is engaging in the same type of activity, national liberation struggle, if you want to call it, or resistance, or just opposing Israeli and Western interests in the region, the same type of demonization is going to occur for the same reasons. Would you agree with that description?
No. So if I had had maybe 20 more minutes, I mean, I mentioned it telegraphically, that Menachem Begin was one of the first and certainly one of the most insistent in Nazifying Palestinians, Yasser Arafat in particular personally, the PLO more broadly, so that this Nazification of Hamas has a long history in Israeli politics. But not everyone who resists is Nazified. The Taliban resisting the Americans in Afghanistan were not Nazified. ISIS resisting Americans in Iraq were not Nazified. They were demonized. They were excoriated as Islamists, even just as Muslims. And of course, there's a very long history of outrageous negative depiction of Muslims going all the way back to the Crusades in Western culture. So we don't need Nazis when we're talking about Muslims. So Jews Nazify their opponents. So that I'm prepared to talk about. Why does that happen? It was argued by Zionists that Jews were slaughtered in Europe because they didn't have a state and they didn't have an army, and therefore they could not protect themselves, and therefore we need a state of Israel, and a strong state of Israel with a strong army will protect Jews. And okay, October 7th kind of proved that that argument was wrong, but that's the argument. Jews have a long history of persecution and oppression in Western Europe. They'll also have many, many periods of coexistence and fluorescence and creative collaboration with their neighbors. The typical narration of Jewish history tends to forget those things and to highlight an unending history of oppression, of which the pinnacle is the Nazi Shoah, the Holocaust. I don't like the term Holocaust. You can ask me why not. I prefer Shoah, the Hebrew term, which is the equivalent of the Arabic Nakba, which means disaster. For Jews, anything bad that happens to us as a collectivity is now filtered through the very conscious ways in which Holocaust commemoration has been generalized and made into a standard of public culture and public morality. And so any attack on Jews as a collectivity, and even individual attacks on individual Jews, for if they are identifiable as such. For example, when blacks attack Hasidic Jews in Brooklyn. Those actions are all filtered through a certain understanding of the Holocaust and the constancy of anti-Semitism in Western culture, and then mobilized to make an argument for the necessity of Israel. So that's a certain recalibration, reimagination of Western history that puts Jewish suffering in the center and a certain interpretation of what that suffering means that has been remarkably successful. Why? So here we have to go place by place and pick apart. Germany. Did West Germany, let's just talk about them, not East Germany, I don't know as much about them. Did West Germany actually undergo any kind of successful denazification? No, hardly at all. First of all, the CIA whisked away the German ballistic missile scientists, took them to the United States to do that work here. A few Nazis were charged at Nuremberg. Nobody was charged with genocide, by the way. And a few others were allowed to escape to Argentina. And German society was allowed to reconstitute itself as an acceptable state in the international system. They paid off Israel, reparations. The state of Israel was somehow, people agreed that they are the material legatees of the victims of the Shoah, the great majority of whom were not Zionists and wouldn't have wanted to go to Israel. But, then the victims conference succeeded in getting billions of dollars more paid to mostly American, but also other diaspora Jews. And now the Germans are kosher if they agree that the security of the State of Israel, as it is currently constituted and with its current policies, is part of what the Germans are repeatedly calling their Staatsräson, their reason of state, a term which is very vague what it means, but it basically means we're supporting Israel no matter what, and we saw that happen after October 7th. So there's a specific mechanism that the German state has used to re-legitimate itself, and which requires a certain understanding of the Nazi period and the mass murder of European Jewry. The United States stood by while Jews were being murdered in Europe. And then, because of anti-Semitism, didn't let the survivors into the United States. So the United States directed them, those 250-ish thousand survivors, to the state of Israel once it was established. So the guilt of the United States is also assuaged by the establishment of the state of Israel and by the support of the state of Israel. Now there's a domestic process that accompanies that, which is the assimilation of Ashkenazi Jewish immigrants, the 2 million plus who flooded into the United States between 1881 and the closure of immigration with the 1924 legislation, which was an openly anti-Semitic act. It was specifically enacted in order to block immigration of Jews from Eastern Europe. And though, nonetheless, many of those Jews assimilated, became white, became upwardly mobile, became doctors, lawyers, university professors, and assumed positions of power in the United States. Now, this is uncomfortable for many Jews to talk about, that Jews are not a persecuted people in the United States. In fact, Jews are an important part of the American power structure. They have owned many of the most important media outlets. They have an important role in Hollywood. They are highly disproportionately represented in the halls of Congress and other lower-level elected offices. This is not a conspiracy. This is not because there is an international Jewish cabal or anything like that. It is because Jewish culture is uniquely suitable to modern Western culture, because Jews were highly literate, because they were not invested in any kind of agricultural or manufacturing processes that tied them to older life ways. They are very mobile, very able to assimilate new norms wherever they go. This is, there's no, the weight of tradition doesn't function in the same way that it would in a long constituted country like France and so on. That's uniquely suitable to the United States, which after all is still a very young country as far as countries go. We could go to a few other places. France, Nazi collaborators, collaborated in the deportation of Jews to Auschwitz. Didn't really even deal with that until the 1980s or so. So support for Israel, that's good. Jews, and we're cool. We didn't do anything wrong. We were occupied. Austria has a similar story about itself. So for all these particular reasons, enough Western countries, enough important and powerful Western countries, have bought into a certain understanding of the history of Europe and, say, the Atlantic world since 1933 that centers a certain understanding of the Jewish experience. So that's very powerful and very particular, and puts the Palestinian people in a very, very difficult situation, which Edward Said understood when he said things like, Palestinians are the victims of the victims, which he understood when he described himself as being the last Jew. So diaspora Palestinians, like Edward Said, and also I think Rashid Khalidi, have understood their relationship to Jews in a very different way than the central elements of the Palestinian national movement. And that's why they were on its margins.
Okay, look, I have many more questions, but I know the audience is sitting here very patiently. So we're past 7 o'clock, so let's open the floor. And if there's time left, I might pose 1 or 2 questions for my
Please, nobody ask me what the Palestinians should do.
Floor is open. Yeah, at the back. Yeah. Absolutely.
Thanks you both for this conversation. So one thing that you said, Joy, made me think about something that I've been sort of wondering about, and I wonder how you would respond. So this has to do with the collapse, fracturing of the international rules-based order, recognizing, of course, that it was never what it was cracked up to be. But one thing that is actually quite notable is that there's all of this discussion about that demise, and as you point out, of course, that the broader discussion is in the face of Donald Trump, but there is, of course, a discussion about the ways in which the genocide in Gaza has contributed to this. But what happens if there's a collapse of the international rules-based order, and none of the people who participate in it notice that collapse? Because that is one of the things that is also sort of remarkable to me, is that there is all of this discussion, and yet nothing is being done any differently with the organizations and the people that have to work with the order. Now, of course, this is a long-term. This kind of process is a long-term process. So, collapse in fact takes quite a long time to notice. So it's sort of a rhetorical question, but I am curious, like what you think about the gap between a recognition in a intellectual sense, a political sense of this real rupture, and yet the kind of plodding along of the system itself.
So, 2 things. First, we haven't spoken about China and Russia. I've sort of shoved them to the side. But Russia attacked Ukraine and invaded Ukraine. And actually that invasion began in 2014, not more recently. And how did the international rules-based order respond to that? They let them get away with it. So in a way you could say the fact that Russia was allowed to annex Crimea was a signal to Israel that they could do what they did in Gaza. S- Point taken, absolutely. Things are not unilaterally causal, but there is a dynamic, a dialectic, we would have said in the old days. Uh, so that's one. Two, it's not actually all that unusual that powers that be and are in the process of becoming powers that were don't recognize the change in their status. Great Britain is still called Great Britain. How great is it? It's like a pipsqueak little island with hardly any international power, and whatever power it has, it's because it's the lapdog of the United States. Well, former great imperial colonial power reduced to nothingness. But is there, they still have a king, and they sing all those songs, and they want to have more positive representation of the imperial period in public schools, which they don't call public schools. I don't know what they call them in Britain. So it's not unusual that the United States and its allies don't want to recognize the collapse of the rules-based international order. I think that we are in a period that Gramsci talked about as an interregnum. The old is dying, the new is not yet born, cannot yet be born, and in the interregnum, a great variety of, what's the rest of the quote? Monsters appear. That's where we are. And that's why it's so difficult to answer questions like, what should the Palestinians do, and what's going to be the future of the state of Israel, and we're not prophets here, but hopefully we can recognize that we are in this kind of interregnum period in which all bets are off, which makes it potentially very dangerous. I don't dismiss out of hand at all the possibility of something like the period of Europe in the 1920s and 30s with the rise of fascism. That is very possible internationally, including in the United States. So we won't know. Well, the United States won't recognize that its period of hegemony is over until long after the fact.
Okay. What should the Palestinians do? No. So
You're a troublemaker,
you know that for a long time. All right. So just to frame it, I mean, Israel has an image right now that is by far the worst I think that it's ever had in all of its existence. We also have Saudi Arabia that is now reorienting its policy and its whole national security program away from at least total dependence on the United States. It probably can't, become totally independent of the U.S., but its defense pact with Pakistan and its contentious relationship now with the UAE, et cetera. We have a Democratic Party that really has no group foreign policy at all on any issue, not just on this one. But we can look at some of the ideas of people like Van Hollen, Bernie Sanders, for that promise some sort of shift. And even some Republicans have been appalled by what they've seen in Gaza. We just saw this woman who was on Trump's religious, whatever it is, religious freedom board, get dismissed because of her stances on Gaza. So my question is, isn't this an opportunity to break the lockstep support of Israel and articulate a different policy? And if it's not, then what's the alternative? And if it is, how should we do that, and what should that policy, practically look like? Since I think we can all rest assured we're not suddenly going to see the United States adopt an anti-Zionist stance.
So yes, there is an opportunity. The happiest day of my life over the past maybe decade or more was the day Zoran Mamdani won the New York mayoralty. And that, I would argue, is the best example for all of us. There have been other smaller scale victories of similar character. I mean, AOC, who Mitchell mentioned, her initial arrival in Congress, the Squad, the addition of Summer Lee, Analilia Mejia's recent victory in the New Jersey primary, the election of 4 DSA members who were immediately joined by 2 others to the City Council of Portland, meaning half the Portland City Council are Democratic Socialists, not the mayor. He's not terrible, but he's not there. We have a Democratic Socialist mayor of Seattle. We have significant numbers of socialist mayors in the city councils of Los Angeles and Chicago. So what all of that, and I'm hardly an expert on American politics or American history. There are people I'm looking at who know way more about this than I do. All of that suggests that where it's possible to make meaningful advances in the current moment in the United States is at the level of cities. We can win a good number of major cities, and in some places like Oregon, which has only one major city and is dominated by it, that's the whole state. So that doesn't translate directly into a different U.S. foreign policy on Israel because cities don't make foreign policy. But it opens a space to talk about things. It legitimizes certain political positions. I think that the establishment Jewish community is going to have a losing fight to try to portray Zoran Mamdani as an anti-Semite when he was endorsed by Brad Lander and he has endorsed Brad Lander running for Congress. I mean, Zoran has showed us what the coalition has to look like. And when it looks like that, the Zionists and Israel supporters can be defeated. So that, all of that, I take as very positive and a possible opening to a much better future than the darker one I depicted on the global level. Can that be translated into a change in American foreign policy, not just on Israel, but more broad? I mean, we're invading Venezuela, blockading Cuba, back to gunboat diplomacy, foreign policy under Trump. So the problem is much broader than Israel-Palestine. If that coalition gathers strength, there's a chance Will that happen tomorrow or next week or next month or next year? No. It also depends on whether or not we have free elections in this country going forward, because all of that has been achieved through very flawed electoral democracy, but better than not electoral democracy. So that's an open question.
Could you say a bit more about what exactly Zoran Mamdani did that was so the cause of your elation? Dig deeper on terms of the Zoran Mamdani campaign in terms of what are the lessons that we should be learning from that particular political campaign?
So there are a lot of lessons to be learned from Zoran's campaign, and I'm not sure. I'm certainly not the best one to separate out his personal brilliance and talents as a politician from the more generalizable. Let me give an initial stab since you asked. So, first of all, 100,000 volunteers in the campaign. That meant that we're having a bottom-up campaign where real people are talking to real other people about what they want and what they need. That's what politics should be about. And broad support from the labor movement, which in New York is much stronger than it is in many other places. Broad support from immigrant and Muslim communities, which in New York are larger than they are in many other places. But even in Portland, Oregon, where those communities are very small, there is a candidate running for Congress in a Democratic primary who is drawing on those communities by speaking out for Palestine. I don't know what her chances of winning are. I'm speaking about Tammy Carpenter. What else? Reaching out to Brad Lander. Absolutely critical in cutting into the capacity of the right-wing Zionist elements that still do dominate the Jewish community in New York, and peeling away a certain component of the Jewish community that was movable. He did what he needed to do to move them. That I don't know if that can happen in Los Angeles, which is structured a little bit differently than New York and is the other place where the Jewish community plays a comparable role in politics. I think it's probably already been done in Chicago. I think those are a lot of lessons we could learn. Maybe there might well be more that I'm not totally, because this isn't exactly my thing.
Hi, thank you again for the talk. I just want you to speak a little bit more about the international solidarity component that you was on the flyer, because I've been thinking about how extraordinary the solidarity movement has been, but really also the importance of a Palestinian and Arab diaspora in that movement. So that you have, on the one hand, people like Noor Erakat and others who are very important on the US side, but also then Mossab Toha ends up in the US, as did some other important people from Gaza and elsewhere. So I would like you to just talk a little bit more about what the components of that solidarity look like. What are the terms of it? Under what terms are people making solidarities? It seems to me that some of the questions you don't want to answer is fine, but the questions under which people decide to connect and create cross-border communities or cross-border advocacies have to do with making decisions about who you ally with and what those alliances look like. So I'd just like to hear you talk a little bit more about that.
So thank you for raising that issue, Melissa. One of the most amazing aspects of what happened internationally in response to the Israeli genocide is huge international movement of solidarity whose political color was a little bit different in different places, depending on how many Palestinians there were in a particular place or how many Muslims there were in a particular place, on the history of activism around Israel, Palestine, but everywhere there was something. And I'm not sure quite how this happened, but the cause of Palestine came to be the emblem of every movement against oppression everywhere. So Black Lives Matter connected to Palestine. There's a very specific mechanism that brought that about, that when Ferguson happened, black journalists went, and who were already involved in Israel, Palestine, and were supporters of Palestinian rights, went and took journalists to the West Bank. And that was a feedback loop that happened and expressed itself in the way that the Palestine Solidarity movement rolled out in the St. Louis area. So this was not only unprecedented and utterly unimaginable. I mean, the most optimistic Palestinians could not have imagined either the level of international solidarity that came to pass, or that Palestine is now the center. Any movement against oppression has to relate itself to Palestine and support Palestinian rights. There's no such thing anymore as progressive accept Palestine, which is the plague that afflicted us for decades in this country. I mean, there might be people who try to occupy that space, J Street, for example, but they have nothing to say to anybody. They still have lots of power in Congress, to be sure, but we're talking about real people, not that class of people. So, again, I don't understand. I can't explain how this happened. Maybe it was because the whole world saw a genocide live streamed on their telephones, and social media has introduced this possibility that never really existed before. Maybe it's because the degree of repression that was exercised against the movement of Palestine solidarity on American college campuses, to be sure, but even more so in Germany and France and the UK, where whatever their equivalent of the Supreme Court is just ruled that the government can't rule that the Palestine campaign is illegal. So whatever mechanism brought that about, it's there, and it hasn't gone away, even as the place of Palestine in the news cycle has diminished somewhat, because Israel is killing fewer Palestinians every day now than they were some months ago. Can that be leveraged into something new and positive? I hope so. that possibility is more than wishful thinking, but less than a practical program that any of us in this room, I think, can probably articulate.
Okay, we have time for one last question.
Thank you, Nader. Thank you, Nader and Joey, for this conversation. Following up on the question of solidarity, one of the things I think a lot of us in this room have noticed is how vulnerable our solidarity is to counterattack and repression. And I want to channel the work of the psychologist Laura Sheehy, who talks about psychological weapons, sort of drawing on Freud and basic concepts like inversion, projection, and disidentification in order to demobilize and demoralize activists. Let me explain. So in fact, in 2023 and 2024, we have an upsurge of student movement protesting genocide, standing up for human rights, and standing up for rule of law, for instance, right? And what we see, in fact, is all those, it's the genocidaires and their supporters who reverse things, project their violence onto the students, and very effectively get the students, well, or us as faculty or activists more generally, it's been very effective to force us to disidentify, to disidentify or to disavow anti-Semitism or disavow Hamas. This is not what the movement was ever about. The movement was about peace, about human rights, and about positive values, but instead, there's this very effective machine, again, sort of inverting what's actually happening, projecting onto opponents or to the solidarity movement their own sins, their own crimes, and forcing people through power plays. Like in our university, dean's offices who get students to come in and sign statements that they're not going to be anti-Semitic again, even though they never were. How could we, as a movement, knowing that this is an operation, how can we build a solidarity that is more impervious to this, that's more protected? The reason I ask is that when you were talking earlier about being victims of victims, that has created this giant machine of weaponizing anti-Semitism, and it's created real vulnerabilities or points of weakness within a solidarity movement.
Excellent question, and I don't have a comprehensive answer. I can observe that it's a normal cycle that there'll be big upsurge, counterattack, and another upsurge. Look at the history of the movement against the Vietnam War. Look at the Black Liberation Movement. It was not just one continuous onward and upward to victory trajectory. That's not how social movements work. There are hills and valleys, and that's normal. There is, of course, the particularity of anti-Semitism at work here. That makes everything a little bit different and more difficult. How do social movements survive the downturns? Small affinity groups, study, personal ties of friendship and solidarity, multiply them 100, 1,000 times. Be conscious of doing that as part of a social movement that's not just you and your 6 friends or whatever, because the enormous movement that erupted on U.S. campuses Where it was most successful, and you could actually see this in some of the videos, it was relying on the personal ties that students had, and often Arab and Jewish or Muslim and Jewish students at places like Columbia and Michigan, where they had a Seder with a little placard that said Zionism is chametz, meaning that it's leavened bread that can't be eaten during Passover. But at that Passover Seder, there are Arab and Muslim and all manner of other students celebrating it. It's that kind of personal relationship. The students who participated in things like that won't forget each other. They're going to have a relationship with each other for the rest of their lives. And we should understand that this is a struggle that is going to go on for all of the rest of all of our lives, however old or young we are. So we need to, I mean, the way American capitalism has worked is to atomize and isolate people, get them fixed on their TV screens or on now their telephones. Remember, there were TV screens that played a similar role before in terms of attracting people's attention, the different corporate structures and such. So we need to think about what can sustain us going forward and connecting those groups at the base level so that we can survive the repression. I don't know what's going to happen to institutions like Georgetown and George Washington University. Are they going to survive as universities with strong components of liberal arts education? There's good reason to think that they may not. And we have to consider what might happen if that model of education collapses and the kinds of mobilizations and demonstrations and so on that it enabled aren't possible in the same way. I know that's a very unsatisfactory answer, and I wish I could give you the big picture way that we're going to win, but I can't.
Well, that's actually cause to think about having you back another time to sketch out that bigger picture. So I just want to end by saying, Joel, obviously this is a very dark moment for this country, for the world, especially for the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. But your presence here helps illuminate a lot of that darkness. So thank you for being here, and we hope we can host you again in the future. Thanks.
Thank you, Nader, and thank you all of you for coming.